Yes, so these cops were breaking windows, and ironically, Giuliani is like a progenitor of broken windows theory. We all know about that. Comes from places like the Manhattan Institute, and he runs against Dinkins again in '93, basically on quality of life policing issues.
Law and order.
Things like, law and order. Because at the time, and this is something that a lot of detractors of Giuliani will point out, is that the statistics on crime, on serious crime, had been going down, and that started in like the late '80s, and Dinkins takes credit for that because he did have some like public spending initiatives, and he did actually invest in the police force. But the truth is, we don't really know why that happened. It was an international phenomenon.
Right.
Like crime was pretty big in the '80s, and then it starts to taper off in the late '80s. And there's a lot of different factors there. A lot of it probably had to do with security cameras, but this can't be isolated to like one city, one mayor. It's like a global phenomenon.
Yeah. Crime statistics also are a diagnostic, and so that, the rate of diagnosis going down doesn't mean that the actual thing is going down. It means that, maybe there's less arrests being made or something.
Right.
The logic of broken windows sort of muddled this, like, in a really vile way. Broken windows started as a theory in 1969. A lot of people don't know this, but the guy who did the Stanford prison experiment, Philip Zimbardo, coined the term broken windows with the initial experiment he did. That coined the term broken windows was that he left a car out in the open in like the Bronx with like a smashed window and the hood up, and then another one in Palo Alto, California, in like a suburban neighborhood.
Great experiment there.
He did this pop science kind of, dubious.
What sort of environmental differences are there between them?
Yeah, and the point he tried to make, I think, was that because the car in the Bronx got stripped immediately and the one in Palo Alto was left alone, it was left alone until he came back and like smashed another window with a sledgehammer, and then when people saw that it was open, they sort of started to take parts off it. He started to draw all these conclusions, and the thing about
Malcolm Gladwell bullshit.
That's exactly right.
Yeah.
Well, the thing about Zimbardo is that he himself is sort of a shitty Malcolm Gladwell pop scientist, and he's cited, to this day by everyone because of the Stanford prison experiment. But Stanford prison experiment's been largely debunked. People just don't look into that sort of thing. It sort of leads to a lot of confirmation bias. It's one of those things people really want to believe. And the broken windows theory, which then, later on was redone in another way where, somebody smashed one window in a building, and then sort of the same conclusions were drawn. Oh, in a shitty neighborhood, people, if they see one window smashed, they'll continue to smash the other ones because they feel licensed, yada, yada, yada. These are soft science conclusions, And what they sort of led to is they sort of enabled a form of, I think, racism that like people already wanted to believe. So they when that was put in the hands of the LAPD, it led them to basically draw this conclusion that, they could enforce more law and order in black and brown neighborhoods because, circularly thinking, well, there's more crime there, and there's more crime there because we enforce more order there, right? And so it became a justification. It also was catalyzed by Malcolm Gladwell.
Oh, no.
He wrote about it. Yeah, he wrote about it in The Atlantic, I think. And he's been interviewed about it like recently, and says he regrets it. But I mean, the guy's a fucking hack.
Paid. He got paid for it. He's fine with it.
He's a hack and a con artist, and him perpetuating that sort of pop science essentially enabled a covert liberal form of racism that was largely identical to the racism of like, overt Archie Bunker types.
Right.
That then.
Yeah.
Oh, that's what Giuliani was their candidate. I mean, I would make.
Yeah, I mean, that's.
Sorry, I'd make two quick points on this. The first is like, from what I read, murders under the last year of Dinkins went down 7%, and the year after, the first year under Giuliani, they went down 14%. So there is a sort of bump there. There's a dip, right, that continues after that time. So the question, if we concede that Giuliani's policies, led to a lessening in violent crime, we have to ask ourselves at what cost, right? If you're talking about mass incarceration, which obviously we're still dealing with in this country, and it's becoming widely, understood and known now that this was a social disaster for millions and millions of people and communities across this entire country, right? At what cost? Have we, brought this kind of this law and order mentality to New York City? How many lives have been destroyed for that? And the other thing that I would say too is, again, to look at this from a historical lens, is that when you're talking about these dipping crime rates and you're talking about the city, quote unquote, turning around, and you mentioned that this was a global trend at this time and certainly a trend in the United States, this was a pivot point. This was when the urban crisis, which began in the late 60s and, continued really into the 70s and 80s, the urban crisis was ending at this point in time. You had mass disinvestment from the 1950s into the 60s and 70s from metropolitan areas, including New York City. It's in the 80s and 90s when reinvestment by capital into these cities begins again. You have something as simple as the crack epidemic kind of petering out because, they've done social science research on it. And part of the reason why the crack epidemic ends is not just because tons of people get thrown in jail for like nonviolent drug crimes. It's also because people in communities that were affected by crack cocaine, there became a serious stigma because the people had 10 years of seeing what crack did to their like friends and their family, their uncle. Okay, I know what crack is now. I'm not going to do crack. And then like something as basic as they took lead out of gasoline and paint. Right? This decreases violent crime and, pathological behavior across American society. And all these things happening just happened to coincide. Again, he was in the right place at the right time with Giuliani being able to take credit for these things. And this bullshit social science you're talking about, Jake, being grafted on that, and say, well, this is the reason why. It was strong policing. It was broken windows theory. It was blah, 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 blah. It all kind of came together and conspired to make Rudolph Giuliani look like a hero as opposed to a petty, narcissistic, violent piece of shit.